Welcome back, YouTube. In part 1 of this video, I talked about why the South seceded from the South's perspective. Now, let's talk about why the North invaded. After the Confederacy formed in February of 1861, one of the first things President Jefferson Davis did was send a peace delegation to Washington, D.C. He wished to establish friendly ties with the federal government and even pay compensation for federal institutions or government buildings within our territory, along with our share of the national debt. Northern ships could even have free use of the Mississippi River. Lincoln refused to see them, declared secession illegal, and said the armies would invade if we did not renounce our independence, rejoin the Union, and pay the tariff, which had just increased. We did not want war, nor did we anticipate it. However, Lincoln was hell-bent on forcing us back into the Union. The only reason war happened in the first place was because Lincoln refused to let us go in peace. Although other Republicans and various Northern business interests played key roles in the decision, it was Lincoln who had to make the decision, and he chose to launch an invasion. The fighting and dying started when the federal armies invaded us. That's why most of the battles were fought in our states. If Lincoln had not launched an invasion, there would have been no war. We, meanwhile, felt we had done nothing wrong and thought secession was legal and that the states remained sovereign even within the Union. Again, I will have a video on the topic. To us, based on American history, wording of the founding documents, and the words of the founding fathers themselves, secession was perfectly legit, and the North could do nothing to stop us. This was a business deal that turned sour, and it was time for us to turn over a new leaf. Even many Northerners thought they had no right to use force to make us stay in the Union. They thought for one state to force another state into staying together through the barrel of a gun was sheer madness. You can't force someone to stay in the Union at gunpoint. That makes the Union no longer voluntary. Thus, you no longer have a Union but an empire. One must only look at Lincoln's inauguration speech to see his determination to force the Union to stay together. Although I won't cover everything, he does promise that there would be no use of force against the South, unless it proved necessary for him to fulfill his obligation to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the federal government, and to collect legal duties and imposts. However, if the South chose to actively take up arms against the government, their insurrection would meet a firm and forceful response. This seems innocent enough. Time to rip it to shreds. To us, Lincoln is threatening to invade the seceded states if we don't continue to pay federal duties and imposts, or the tariff, and if we don't allow the federal government to occupy and maintain all federal installations within our borders. Let's use the example of the American Revolution. Imagine what the American patriots would have thought if the British had said to them, "We want peace, but we're going to invade you if you don't keep paying our tariff and if you don't allow us to occupy and maintain all British installations within your borders." The colonists would have rightly regarded this as a virtual declaration of war. Thus, we were very unhappy with it. 2 weeks later, we fired on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a Union fort in the middle of Charleston Harbor, the main harbor of South Carolina. We never denied that we fired on Fort Sumter, but we claimed that it was in self-defense. To understand what happened, let's go back to right after South Carolina seceded. At the time of secession, Fort Sumter was actually abandoned. The garrison that occupied it in April of 1861 was actually at Fort Moultrie. Finding it unable to defend, they moved, without federal permission, to the previously abandoned Fort Sumter. Considering South Carolina considered itself an independent nation, they viewed this as a hostile act. However, when the garrison moved to Fort Sumter, the South did not immediately fire on the fort. The reason why is because the Secretary of State, William Seward, promised that the fort would be evacuated. Thus, South Carolina patiently waited. In addition, the garrison was allowed to buy groceries in the city of Charleston up until April 5th. Even after that, they were given food by civilians. At the same time, Lincoln and Northern newspapers claimed the troops were starving. To us, this argument is null and void. Going back to Lincoln and the starving troops, Lincoln ordered that a relief convoy be sent to aid the troops at the fort. Meanwhile, William Seward was still telling the now Confederate States of America that the fort would be evacuated. We eventually found out about the relief convoy and were shocked. Not only was the fort not going to be evacuated, we saw that the convoy was a military convoy, including it warships, over 1,000 troops, landing craft, and plenty of ammunition. To us, this was a virtual declaration of war. Even members of Lincoln's cabinet told him so. Caleb B. Smith, Lincoln's Secretary of the Interior, told Lincoln that if they sent provisions to the fort, it would trigger a civil war. Apparently, despite Lincoln's plea that he wanted peace, he was purposefully provoking war. If his cabinet told him sending provision would provoke conflict, which all but 2 did, he sends an armed flotilla anyways, and war breaks out. We obviously could not take Lincoln's cries for peace seriously. After we fired on Fort Sumter, Lincoln sent a note to Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox, stating, "I sincerely regret that the failure of the attempt to provision Fort Sumter should be a source of annoyance to you. You and I both anticipated that the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter even if it should fail, and it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation is justified in the results. Based on this, what happened at Fort Sumter, rallying the nation to war, is exactly what Lincoln wanted. 2 days after we fired on Fort Sumter, the fort surrendered. The only casualty during the fight was one of our horses. No lives were lost in the conflict. After the garrison surrendered, they were not arrested. They were allowed to go home. After we captured the fort, we thought everything was over. We even offered to pay compensation for the fort. Even at this point, we did not want war. We honestly thought that the conflict was done with. Lincoln, however, had other intentions. Like Pearl Harbor and 9/11, Fort Sumter was used as a rallying cry for the nation to go to war. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. At this point, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. They had initially voted against secession. Only after Lincoln had called for troops to forcibly keep them in the Union did they secede. They seceded because of their objection to the federal government's use of force rather than slavery, according to us. On a side note, once we seceded, the Republicans, without us to stop them, raised the tariffs, taxes on imports and exports, from 20% to 50% and created a national banking system to help big business. Before this, control of banking systems was delegated mostly to the states, which had various ways of managing them, depending on the state. Before leaving Fort Sumter, I'll end with a quote from Jefferson Davis on why we attacked the fort. "The attempt to represent us as the aggressors in the conflict which ensued is as unfounded as the complaint made by the wolf against the lamb in the familiar fable. He who makes the assault is not necessarily he that strikes the first blow or fires the first gun. To have awaited further strengthening of their position by land and naval forces, with hostile purpose now declared, for the sake of having them fire the first gun, would have been as unwise as it would be to hesitate to strike down the arm of the assailant, who levels a deadly weapon at one's breast until he has actually fired. After the assault was made by the hostile descent of the fleet, the reduction of Fort Sumter was a measure of defense rendered absolutely and immediately necessary. However, this leaves one basic question. Why would Lincoln provoke a war to conquer us? Well, let me state what it wasn't over: slavery. Not again. Will you guys please just let me talk for once? Look, we must distinguish between factors and causes. Slavery was one of several factors that led to the war, but the cause of the conflict was the Republicans' refusal to allow us to leave in peace. The role that slavery played as a factor that led to the war was similar to the role that oil played as a factor that led to the first Gulf War in 1991. If there had been no Kuwaiti oil fields, Iraq would not have invaded Kuwait, and the first Gulf War would not have been fought. But no credible analyst would suggest that therefore that war was fought over oil, or that oil caused the war. The first Gulf War was fought because Iraq invaded Kuwait. America and her allies fought the war in order to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. It's true that America liberated Kuwait in large part to ensure a stable flow of oil from the country, but there would have been no war if Iraq had not invaded Kuwait. Furthermore, the Kuwaitis who fought in the war were fighting first and foremost to repel an invader and regain their independence, not to protect their oil fields. The North did not attack us to free the slaves. Lincoln repeatedly stated this, both in speeches and private conversations. If we had not seceded, there would have been no war, and slavery would have continued. If we had surrendered when Lincoln issued his call up for an invasion force, there would have been no war, and slavery would have continued. If Jefferson Davis's first announcement as Confederate president had been that we were going to abolish slavery, Lincoln and the radicals still would have invaded us. If we had informed Lincoln at any point during the war that it was going to start an emancipation program, Lincoln would not have suddenly called off federal invasion. Not once did any Republican leader offer to halt the federal invasion if we would agree to abolish slavery. The key issue was our independence, not slavery. Whether or not the war eventually turned into a crusade against slavery, I will discuss that in another episode when I talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Either way, the war was not initially waged against slavery. I would talk more about this, but I will leave slavery for another episode. Alright then. Now that I've stated why the war was not waged, let's talk about why it was. Well, granted, there are many clear answers. No one wants to lose 25% of their country with 9 million citizens, numerous riverways, farmlands, etc. Also, several reasons were stated last episode. However, there were much more devious reasons. Some of our authors argued Lincoln wanted to transform the United States from a weak, decentralized government supported by small but strong self-sufficient nations called states into a strong central government of ruling over weak subservient states. Basically, he wanted to enlarge both the federal government and the powers of the president. However, he could do neither if we seceded. If he let us go, he would have to admit that the states have the power, not the national government. Thus, any attempts to enlarge the national government would be countered by critics using the example of their new next-door neighbor. Also, the United States would be a radically different nation with us gone. Basically, we were a peg on the stool. You take that peg out, and all the other pegs have to reorganize themselves. In the end, the stool could have an entirely different foundation. Needless to say, I don't think Lincoln would have wanted that. Redefining a nation would put a halt to his supposed dreams of a big government. However, that's not the main issue. For that, let's go back to taxes. As we claimed, we paid a majority of the nation's taxes. No more us means no more taxes. To make things worse, in March 1861, when the North announced its new 50% tariff rate, we announced our virtually non-existent tariff rate. I don't have an exact statistic. As a result, all foreign goods would come into the region through us, because it was cheaper. Basically, the North's tariff did nothing. Thus, the North would have to lower its tariff in order to compete with us. Consequently, northern businesses would no longer be protected, and would have international competition for manufactured goods. As a result, northern businessmen were worried that their business empires were threatened. In turn, they demanded Lincoln to not let us go in peace. On a completely unrelated note, around this time, newspapers switched from wanting to let us go in peace to demanding we be invaded. Curious, ain't it? Just as we worried about being subjugated by northern interests, the North feared economic ruin. You think I'm exaggerating? Well, let me read a piece from the New York Times on March 30th of 1861. The predicament in which both the government and the commerce of the country are placed, through the non-enforcement of our revenue laws, is now thoroughly understood the world over. If the manufacturer at Manchester, England, can send his goods into the western states through New Orleans at a less cost than through New York, he is a fool for not availing himself of this advantage. If the importations of the country are made through southern ports, its exports will go through the same channel. The produce of the West, instead of coming to our own port by the millions of tons, to be transported abroad by the same ships through which we received our importations, will seek other routes and other outlets. With the loss of our foreign trade, what is to become of our public works, conducted at the cost of many hundred millions of dollars, to turn into our harbor the products of the interior? They share in the common ruin. So do our manufacturers. Once at New Orleans, goods may be distributed over the whole country duty-free. This process is perfectly simple. The commercial bearing of the question has acted upon the North. We now see clearly whither we are tending, and the policy we must adopt. With us, it is no longer an abstract question, one of constitutional construction, or of the reserved or delegated power of the state or federal government, but of material existence and moral position both at home and abroad. We were divided and confused until our pockets were touched. Put simply in another newspaper article at the time, it is very clear that the South gains by this process, and we lose. No, we must not let the South go. I'm not saying the North would have died with us gone, but the North definitely had these fears. Either way, to us, this is why the North invaded, to protect their business empires and large government aspirations, not for the highly moralistic principles of the Founding Fathers and saving the Union. Well, I suppose I am out of time. Considering I've covered the basics of the Southern arguments, I will end the episode here. Just to repeat my point, I am not siding with the South. These are their arguments. I will admit that both sides have strong and weak points in their arguments. I'm not here to judge. The truth, in all honesty, probably lies where it normally does, somewhere in between. What the truth is, I don't know. People have spent their entire lives dedicated to that question, and they still don't know. Now then, although I'm going to regret saying this, I would like to hear from you. Which argument did you find more compelling? Have I presented both arguments fairly and equally? Did I completely botch something? What is the next Civil War video you want me to make? Or should I even make another one? Would secession have destroyed the North? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I will do my best to present to you with an accurate version of history, but after all, I'm just a pony. Until next time, this is Steam Shadow, signing off.